This is the ESL teaching track, and this is your Q&A with experienced ESL teachers. So that's myself. You have Nikki Ashcraft here with us as well. And I think Angela, yes, and Angela Garcia is with us. And I see some other people on here that I know are also experienced ESL teachers. So feel free to jump in and contribute to any of the questions that we talk about. So, okay, so I'm seeing that many of you have learned something. That's good, since if you've spent the whole day with us, we want you to learn something, right? And so here's kind of the plan for this session. So our number one goal is to answer your questions. I know that when teachers come to a training, it's often the case that they may have some questions in their minds, and there might just not be the perfect time to ask them at these other sessions. So this is your chance. So if you have questions that you want to ask, then I would love for you to put those questions in the chat. However, I also know that sometimes you've been here a long time today, right? And you might have questions, but it might just even be hard to formulate them in your mind at this point. So we have together created a list of questions that we get from students, well, really from ESL teachers on a regular basis. And so if you don't put questions in the chat, then we're going to talk about the questions we have, or the questions that we tend to get a lot. So I do see a question in the chat. Thank you, Fran, for dropping that in. So Fran says, what's a good way to advertise our program? So I'll share some ideas, and then I'll pass it on over for anybody else who wants to answer. So one of the best ways to advertise your program is to make sure that people in your local community know, because your local community are the ones who are going to come take classes with you. In community-based programs, students are relatively unlikely to drive all the way across the Metroplex. So if you've got a way that you can let people around your area know, I see lots and lots of big banners, free ESL classes, a delivery. You could do a mailer, or you could canvass the neighborhood and put flyers on doors and just let people know that you are offering ESL classes. But because they're ESL classes, I suggest that you think about the language of your neighbors and put that flyer not just in English, but also in Spanish or Vietnamese or Chinese or whatever language is common in your neighborhood. And you make sure that you advertise that to them in that way. So anybody else, Nikki, Angela, or anybody else want to address the advertising question?
I do have a suggestion. So in the presentation I did, I talked about like a community resource guide. Some local areas do have those. And if you can get your program in one of those, that would be great. Also posting things, like Cindy said, around the local community, but especially places like the public library or the laundromat, places like that where people go. Those are great ways, and really word of mouth. I mean, that's how a lot of people find out about Literacy Connexes.
Yeah, the other thing I'll add to that is that Tarrant Literacy Coalition, I believe, keeps a list of all of the community-based ESL programs in the Metroplex, or at least in Tarrant County. And you might, if you're in Tarrant County, contact Tarrant Literacy Coalition and let them know you're offering classes, because then if people reach out to them, they can direct people to your program. And making sure the public school close to you, whatever public school is closest to you, knows that you're offering classes is also another thing that you could make sure to do to advertise your program.
I agree that word of mouth is sometimes the best advertising. I would also suggest going to ethnic businesses, so different ethnic restaurants, other kinds of businesses that are owned by immigrant and refugee entrepreneurs, and telling them about your program and asking them if you can put your flyer in their window, because if they are providing services to those communities, their own communities, then they'll be attracting those kinds of customers to their businesses, and then they'll be able to see your flyers. So I think just really being involved and integrated with the immigrant and refugee communities will help you have exposure.
All right, so I am going to move on from there to, so we have a suggestion in the chat from Lori. Make a good flyer to pass around, contact school district ESL and bilingual teachers because their students likely have parents who may want some classes. Great ideas, okay? The next question that we have is ideas for summer engagement remotely while students are on break or traveling. So Angela or Nikki, I'm going to let one of you guys address that first, and then I'll round it out at the end.
Our school, we were using Rosetta Stone for a long time, and it was just too expensive. So we started using Duolingo.com. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but it's not like the best engage, but it is practice in English, and it gets harder as they go through the levels. And if they do just a little bit every day, it will keep them, it makes them talk, it makes them read, it makes them type and all that. So that's something that we use. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I think there are any number of resources online that students could be engaging with independently. And I had shared some of those like reading resources in my presentation on differentiation, like the News Easy, News and Levels and things like that students could be reading on their own. There are also some websites. One is called Randall's Cyber Listening Cafe that has listening on there. There's another one called, it's OLLLI, so I'm not sure how to pronounce that. That's also a listening website. And what I really like about that one is that the recordings are people from different countries. So they will hear different accents, and they will also see speakers who are like them, people who have learned English as a second or foreign language and who are using the language to communicate. So there's a number of websites that students could engage with on their own if they're on vacation or traveling. But also if you have some kind of Facebook page for your class, or if they're on WhatsApp together, you can be doing activities with them through that device as well. So maybe Cindy wants to talk more about that.
I'm just agreeing with you,
Yeah.
Nikki, that I have several of my TESOL students who are keeping up with their class over WhatsApp. They send them voice recordings. They have students send voice recordings to them. If they see something cool and interesting, they'll post about it in their group, and it encourages the students to do the same, but it's not an assignment. But if you were in Angela's session this morning, she talked about Jamboard and Flipgrid, and that's also an easy way to get students to interact and to do things over summer. You can say, I'm gonna create a Flipgrid for the summer where you can share your adventures, right? And students can go in and do that, even if it's not a set assignment for them. We used to give our students a vacation scavenger hunt where we give them a list of things to take pictures of while they were on vacation. And then when they came back, it gave us a wealth of information to talk about because they could choose one of their pictures and they could tell the story. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're interacting while they're on vacation, but it gives you things to do with them once they're back in your class after vacation. I love these sites that both Angela and Nikki shared, and I think those are great options as well. The links are in the chat for those, so feel free to pull any of those and take a look at them. And I'll open it out to the rest of you who are also teaching, and I know you have great ideas. What else do you do to keep students engaged remotely while they're on break or traveling? If you do have something you want to share, feel free to drop it in the chat at any point. We are more than happy to have you share, because you guys have great ideas and we want to hear them too. All right. Oh, ask for postcards. Sharon, that's a great idea. If students are traveling, ask them to send you a postcard. Ask them to call you, right? Leave you a voice message, depending on where they're traveling, right? Don't incur massive long distance and roaming fees, but they can send you a voice message and tell you about where they are, and it keeps them connected and engaged with you. All right, great ideas. Sorry, I'm scrolling back up in the chat to see what our next question was. Okay, so the next question was curriculum recommendations. So there are some pretty standard curriculum programs that a lot of community and faith-based programs use. So Side by Side used to be a favorite, but I think it may be out of print. Ventures is extremely popular. Oh my gosh, my mind just went blank. Karen mentioned one in her presentation that they use, and now I cannot remember what it's called. But if you're using a particular curriculum, feel free to tell us. Oh, okay, so Angela says Touchstone and Inside the USA. Okay. Any other thoughts on curriculum? Nikki, do you have any particular ones that you recommend?
I am putting some in the chat here because when I think curriculum, I'm not just thinking textbook. Yeah. I'm thinking an actual curriculum document that lays out what students learn at each proficiency level. So I'm putting one in here. It's from the Arlington, Arlington REAP program is called, but it's for adult education. And on this site, they have under instructional planning, they actually have a whole curriculum there with for every level, what the students learn in it, and they have lesson plans and activities. Let's see, there's 7, looks like 10 levels. So it's a very well-developed program. So yeah, that's one thing I would look at if you're looking at creating a curriculum.
Yeah. Yeah, Lori, I see that you dropped, I think it's a Word doc in, great ESL website for practice this summer. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, yes, I'm just going to pass that out to my adult students before we break for the summer. It just has websites where they can practice, pretty good websites. Did it go through okay? Did you see it?
I see it. I haven't tried to download it yet.
Okay.
But I definitely see it.
Yeah. And I'm going to encourage them just to email me throughout the summer and keep up the communication.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things when you've developed relationships with your students, they want to share with you and you want to share with them. So that makes it easier to remain engaged and interacting over the summer, even if you're not in class.
Yes.
Okay, so you've got lots of suggestions in the chat, milestones, life change, English in action, all of those are there for ideas, and a bunch of websites also there for you to take a look at in terms of curriculum. So Rosie is asking a really important question too. So what are some strategies for volunteer engagement? How do you get volunteers engaged in your program? So anybody want to take that to start with? Okay, I will take that to start with. So, one of the things that in talking with students, so I work with a lot of students at UT Arlington who are required for their classes to volunteer. And some of the things that they tell me that make it difficult to volunteer is a lack of flexibility. So programs often want their teachers to be there 2 nights a week for 2 hours. And a 4-hour commitment is a lot for students who have lives, who have jobs, who have families and things like that. So flexibility, if a student could come on one night and if a volunteer could come 1 night a week instead of 2 nights a week, that would be helpful. A lot of our students don't feel ready to be in a classroom yet, and they are terrified at the idea of teaching a class and being the teacher. So we try to hook them up with programs that will allow them to be an assistant to the teacher to start with, instead of the teacher of the class. So having an assistant program where volunteers can come in and work with another teacher and observe that teacher and see what that teacher does before they have to step out and teach the class themselves is really super important, because they then build their confidence in that classroom. Another thing that our students struggle with at times is childcare. So they can't go volunteer because childcare ends at 6 p.m. And if the classes that they need to volunteer in are in the evening, they can't go because they have a child that they can't leave at home. This is also a problem for your students. So providing childcare will help you with students as well as with volunteers, right? I'll stop talking there and I'll give other people a chance to talk about volunteer, thinking about volunteers.
Yeah, I think if there are 2 volunteers or 2 teachers assigned to each class, that also helps make the work less onerous, that they can work together to divide up the teaching responsibilities and decide if they're doing differentiation, who's going to work with which group. So there's a lot of benefits to having multiple teachers in the room, but it's also beneficial for the teachers themselves, because if one person needs to be absent, for some reason, then there's still the other person to cover. So they don't feel like they have all the responsibility on themselves. That if something happens in their life and they can't make that commitment, then there is somebody else to cover it. So I think people will be more likely to volunteer when they know that, if they know, like, well, I have a vacation planned or a trip planned for this 1 week, I'm not going to be able to do it. If they think they're going to be the only one in the room, then they might be less likely to volunteer because they know that they have other things coming up. But if they know that someone else is going to be there with them, then okay, it's all right if they miss 1 week for that trip, that there's somebody else who can cover it and they can kind of tag team with each other. So I think that makes many teachers feel more comfortable, is when they know there's going to be another teacher in the room with them.
Yeah. My church is about to restart their ESL ministry, and I'm so excited to finally be able to volunteer at my church to teach ESL. But I had to be really honest with the coordinator and say, I want to help, I want to come teach, but there are just some weeks where my work schedule is not going to allow it. So I need another teacher there with me so that they can step in if I'm not there. So even experienced teachers benefit from having a second teacher in the classroom that can take over as needed.
And I think having testimonies from your students to speak at different events at your church to talk about how the ESL program has impacted their lives and help them adapt to life in the United States and to be successful here, that can also, touch the hearts of the members of your congregation and inspire them to be ESL teachers at your church when they know that it is going to have an impact.
Yeah, when we think about the confidence of volunteers, I always recommend sending your volunteers to conferences like this, to Literacy Texas symposiums and conferences, and also to the trainings that Literacy Connects Us does, where we do a specific teacher training for teachers to work with beginning students. Providing that option for your teachers who don't feel confident of being in the classroom can make them feel a little bit better about stepping into a classroom. Somebody else can feel free if you have something else to say about volunteering. I have to scroll back up and see what the next question was. Oh, that might have been the last question. So I'll open the floor again and ask if you have any questions. And if you don't, I'm going to move on to our questions. So I'm going to show you a tool that I love. I'm going to share my whole screen with you so that I can still see you while I do this. Maybe Maybe not. Okay, so this is called Wheel of Names. Has anybody used Wheel of Names before? So it's just a name picker. So you can see you enter, normally you're entering students' names, and you can use this in class for random generator for different tasks and things like that. I'm using it for our questions. So I've entered all the questions, the 15 questions we came up with, and then I'm going to pick a question with it. So here's our question. It's coming, it's coming. Okay. Oh, great question. So some students in my class always shout out the answers while others never say anything. How can I ensure that everyone participates? So just to make sure you know about this tool, you can close this and it leaves the name, or in our case, the question, in the pot. So the student could be called on multiple times. What I'm going to do is remove, and that takes this question out so we won't see it again. But that way, if you're trying to make sure every student talks, if you do remove, then it removes students who have already talked. So that's already one thing you can do, is use a random name generator to have students be the next person to talk. But I saw Angela get super excited about this question, so I'm going to let her talk now.
I have a really good one for this. Because I have some kids that will not stop talking and they want to answer everything. So what I started doing was I put Post-its on their desk, like they get, depending on the day, 2 or max 3. And then if they speak or answer a question, I take away a Post-it. So they know that they have to say, if they use them all up, they can't say anything for the rest of class. So they usually try and ration out their Post-its. That works for me. I love it. It's the best thing. I that's what works for me, and I love it.
I love that idea. More ideas about how to make sure everybody talks?
I think it's important when you set up an activity to tell students, this is the activity we're going to do, and this is how I would like to see the interaction in this activity. I'm saying, this is how I would like for us to interact. And so what I mean is, if it's supposed to be just a whole class discussion, so, say that, okay, this is going to be a whole class discussion now. You don't have to raise your hand. Anybody can talk, put out those parameters. Or if you want to go through an exercise and you want to call on people to respond, and you don't want them just shouting out answers, say that we're going to go through this exercise now. And I'm going to ask each one of you to answer one of the questions. So please raise your hand when you're ready to answer. So just give them some guidelines for about what you're going to do and how you expect everyone to engage or interact during that activity.
Great ideas. I do a lot of this sort of open discussion of this type. You don't have to raise your hand, just tell me an answer. But then that, those students who want to answer every question tend to dominate that. So then I start doing some semi-random things. So I'll say something like, if my talkative student is on this side of the room, I'll say, okay, for this next question, I want somebody on this side of the room to answer. So it eliminates that student as an option because they're on the wrong side of the room to answer. Or I've even been known to do things like, somebody who is wearing blue jeans, answer the next question, right? And I can semi-randomly do that. I can use it totally randomly if I want to, but I can also exclude or include particular students based on what their level of participation has been that day. We also talked earlier about students being afraid to answer sometimes because they think they might be wrong and they want to save face. And we talked about the value of pairing them up and letting them talk with a partner first and get verification that their answer is right before they have to shout out the answer to the whole class. And that can help the quieter students be more willing to participate as well. Any other ideas anybody wants to toss out there? Nobody said popsicle sticks yet, did they? So popsicle sticks, write every student's name on a popsicle stick and put it in a cup and you pick them out. It's just like the random name picker online, right? I don't like putting students on the spot, so I always pick very strategic times when I'm going to do that, when it's questions where they're not going to lose face and I know everybody's going to have an answer. But it can actually, you can make sure everybody talks, and it's a way to keep the very talkative one from not talking too much. All right.
And I think you can also, we talked about assigning roles in the previous session, but sometimes giving those more talkative students a task to do, like, okay, you're going to write the answers on the board. So when everyone else is answering, they are writing the answers on the board. So that keeps them busy writing. And so that gives other people a chance to talk.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to move on to the next question. So okay, so this is actually going back to the volunteer question. This is what stops some volunteers from volunteering, is that they're worried. They say, I don't know English grammar. What am I going to do if I get asked a question that I don't know the answer to? So Angela and Nikki, start us out. What do we do if we don't know the answer?
Well, I would hope that you've done enough preparation for your class, that you would have reviewed the content that's going to be presented, and so that you would have some idea of how to answer. But sometimes students come out with these questions that are way out there and have nothing to do with your lesson. And so sometimes I would point that out if they're asking a question during the class and it's not really related to what you're teaching and it's kind of out there, maybe you don't know, but you might point to your objectives for today's lesson and say, well, this is what we're studying today. We're going to get to that in a future week. So you don't have to answer it on the spot, but you might also tell them, well, we can look up the answer to that after class. And that way you are addressing that they have a question, but that you're not going to answer it right at that point. But sometimes just, admitting that, even as a native speaker, we don't know everything about our own language, and to tell them that you will look up an answer or you will get back to them with an answer. And then the next week, then at the beginning of the class, you can present the answer to that question. So it's okay to admit sometimes that you don't know an answer to a particular question. And I would think, though, with beginner students, usually I think sometimes teachers want to teach beginners because they think they're not going to ask me those hard questions. So you will probably know most of the answers to those beginner level questions. But once students get more advanced and they start to have these tougher grammar questions, you can put it back on them to try to find the answers to those questions themselves, because you want them to be self-directed. You're not always going to be around as the teacher to help answer all their questions. So maybe directing them to some resources, a grammar book, a dictionary, a website where they could look for the answer themselves, I think, for those tougher questions.
Great strategies. Angela, do you want to add anything to that?
I was going to say the same thing, like if you don't know it, just tell them we'll look it up. But I'm with you on the grammar part. I didn't really know a lot of grammar and why we did things the way we do until I started teaching ESL, and they're like, well, why do we do it this way? And so I had to learn that I have to be able to explain, okay, this is why we do it. And the kids actually, their questions made me think more about why do we do it this way? And so, and like you said, the older kids, I would get them to look it up and, okay, teach me, tell me what you know. And so same thing. I mean, that's what I would do.
Yeah, agreed. I sometimes say, oh, that's such a great question. That's your homework, right? So they have to look it up. I do a lot of, I'm going to have to think about that. And then I usually have an agenda on the board, and, Nikki referred to pointing out your objectives and saying that's not today, but I'll add it to the bottom of my agenda. And I can always make sure we don't get that far, right? And then I have time then to look it up and come back and answer it at the next class period if the students really want to know about it. But sometimes if I say to students, that's a really good question, I'm going to have to think about it. remind me next week. It's not an important enough question for them. So you've satisfied their need to ask the question and you've told them you'll think about it, and you should still think about it, but they might never bring it up again. So if you feel it's an important concept to teach in your class, you have to make sure to bring it back up. But maybe you want to skip it, in which case you just look it up, make sure you know, but you leave it up to them to bring it up again some other time.
Now, I've had students ask me questions sometimes that really didn't even make sense to me. And what I mean is that they heard something, or they thought they heard something, or they thought they read something, but they misinterpreted it. And so when they come to you and say, well, I heard somebody say this, is that correct? And I always have to say, well, I need to see the context. If you saw it in a video or heard it in a song or whatever, show it to me, because from what they tell me, it doesn't make enough sense for me to be able to provide an explanation. So sometimes asking them to provide more context around what they think they heard or saw will enable you to better answer their question.
I think this question may have also partially got asked. My program doesn't have textbooks. What should I teach? So Nikki gave us some great suggestions and websites. So Nikki, I'm going to hand this to you to ask, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I've actually had a lot of my TESOL students ask me this, because they go to the program, and then the program says, well, oh, we have this library of books that you can choose from. And then they just really don't know what to do. So I think it's really important to get to know your students and to do that kind of a needs analysis to find out what level of proficiency are they, what are they capable of doing, and then what do they want to learn. If your program doesn't have a book or a curriculum, then it's kind of open, there. And so you can find from your students what they would like to learn and build your lessons around that. But also there are, if your program does not have a curriculum document, you might look at the REAP example from Arlington, Virginia, that I put in the chat. Some of the standards documents, like from the Department of Education, the English language proficiency standards for the U.S. Department of Education, have different like criteria that should be addressed at each level, as does the Texas English language proficiency standards for adults, and those are very closely tied to the workplace. So explore some of those standards documents, get to know your students, see what they're interested in learning. If they are advanced enough, then you might even ask them to vote on different topics that you might discuss in class or work on in class. So really, you want to make sure that whatever you are teaching is relevant and meaningful for the learners. So, as adults, that's important for their persistence and attendance in class. If they're coming to class and feel like you're just wasting their time, they're not going to keep coming. So I think really tying it very closely to what the students want to learn and need to learn would be important in this case.
I agree. Angela, do you want to add anything to that?
The same thing, like I would figure out what level, what do they need. A lot of my students, they need survival vocabulary because they're all brand new. And so we start with the basics. This is a pen, this is a desk. And I mean, we have books, but what do they need to survive? We do, the first week of school, we do like a scavenger hunt on, oh dang, it's called, I can't remember the website now, but there's a like scavenger hunt website. And I take pictures around the building. So Goose Chase, thank you. It's Goose Chase. And I take pictures around the building, and then kids take their cell phones and they take pictures. So they're learning how to navigate, just things that they need to be able to function. That's what we start with. And then we go from there. We just work our way up.
Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. Oh, how do my learners understand me if I only speak English? So I'll start briefly by saying body language is your best friend. Using gestures. There's a thing called TPR, total physical response, where you're using a lot of your body and kinesthetic things to help students with learning. And there's a lot of repetition and a lot of simplicity in terms of working with students who really don't know any English yet. Again, though, if you've been at one of our recent trainings where Olga does her Russian, Olga teaches high school and was unable to be here today, or I was going to have her do it for you today. But you know, she does an entire lesson in Russian, and by the end of the lesson, we know at least 5 or 10 vocabulary words in Russian. That might be all we know, but it's something, and we know what those words are. So yes, it can be done. Angela and Nikki, what would you like to add to that?
So I do not speak any of the, well, I speak Spanish a little bit, but I have students that speak Vietnamese, Chinese, Thai, Quiche, a variety of languages, and there's no way I could speak every language. So like Cindy said, TPR and all that, but I use Google Images a lot. I will, if I try to explain something and they're like, they look at me like clueless, I'll pull up a picture if I can find a picture, or I'll draw. I'm not a great artist, but I'll try and draw the picture. I also use Realia, which is like, show them the object. This is a pen, you know, so using real objects to help them learn. That's what I do.
Whenever people find out that I'm an ESL teacher, they always ask me, oh, how many languages do you speak? Because they think we must speak every language of all of our students. And I do speak some foreign languages, but no, you don't have to speak a foreign language to be an ESL teacher. And yes, I agree with what Cynthia and Angela have said about using our gestures and using many pictures. And when it comes to doing activities, I think it's very helpful to model what you want the learners to do. So you might get that more proficient student to come up to the front of the class with you, and you do the exercise together, or you model the dialogue together so that students know exactly what you want them to do. But you know, if you're working with those 0 proficiency students, you really have to show everything. So when you want them to do the exercise in the book, you're like, okay, now we're going to do an exercise in the book. Get your book. And then, you know, everybody starts reaching for their book, you know, and then you're like, okay, we're going to be on page 72, write 72 up on the board. We're here on lesson B, and we're going to do 1, grammar, right? And so you're showing it, and you're walking around the whole room to make sure that everybody is on the right page and in the right place. And very often, if, you know, when they see the other students doing it, then they're going to copy what the other students are doing as well. So really that modeling with the lower proficiency students is so important, because they might not understand your words. So showing them what you want, and also sometimes reinforcing what you're saying by writing things on the board so they can hear it and see it at the same time.
I'm going to tag on to that. You know, my poor students, my TESOL students, one of the things I harp on with them when they create activities is that they must have instructions written on the page, because students need to hear the instructions, but they also need to read the instructions. And I think it was Nikki earlier that was talking about how, like in assessing students, we can't just assess their oral skills, we also have to assess their written skills. So it's surprising to me how often we have students come in who are very proficient readers, but who cannot hold a conversation at all in English, or vice versa. They can talk a lot in English, but they can't read at all. So we really need to reinforce both the written and the oral so that we catch both groups of students, right? So if they don't understand what we're saying, maybe they'll understand what they're reading and vice versa.
Yeah, and with regards to instruction, sometimes learners need to be taught that instruction language. Like when it says match, what does that mean? When it says circle, so what are they circling? So learning to actually read the instructions for themselves and teaching them that instructional language, that's going to be very helpful for them when they get into assessments and they have to do it on their own and you're not there to explain everything for them or model for them. So I know my own experience, I have studied Arabic for many years and I never learned the instructional language. So I would see like 2 columns and I say, okay, that's a matching exercise, but I never learned how to read the instructions myself. So I think when we can teach learners how to read the instructions, they know that instructional language themselves, that again helps them to be more self-directed, and then they don't have to keep calling you over, what am I supposed to do, what am I supposed to do, because they can read those instructions themselves.
Absolutely. Anything else anybody wants to add? Because if not, I'm picking a new question. Okay, so this is actually a similar question, right? What if my learners can't write in English orthography? How do we even begin with them? Well, the first thing I'm going to suggest is that you contact Tainum Johnson, who might have a new last name now. I'm sorry, Tainum, at Literacy Connexus. She's been working on researching and putting together presentations about working with pre-literate learners or people who don't read and write, but some of that transfers into working with learners who don't use English orthography yet. So she's a great person to talk to start with if you're working with students that need to learn how to write the alphabet in English. Nikki and Angela, what would you like to add?
I feel like you just have to start them where they are. Like if that's what they need, then that's what you have to do. I don't know what grade you teach, Nikki, but I teach high school 9th grade, and we have a lot of kids that come that are SLIFE that they haven't been. I had one student that came that hadn't been in school since like 4th grade, and he's already like 17 years old, and so the gap is huge. He's not even literate in his first language. I mean, he couldn't even write the alphabet in his first language. He didn't even know that when we gave him papers that he was supposed to pass them back. Like we had to teach him that, like we give you a paper, take one, pass it back. So we had to start at the very beginning. He was like his own class by himself. I mean, we had to do we started him at the very basics, and I know it's hard to have him. He's supposed to be on grade level, but we couldn't. We had to meet him where he was and then work from there.
I think there could be a whole presentation, multiple trainings on this topic. So I don't think it's something we can answer in like 5 minutes, but I think it is very important when learners are starting to learn how to write words that are meaningful to them and words that they know. And a lot of the phonics materials that are developed for children might use words that the adults would not know because they are not native English speakers. And also a lot of the phonics materials that are created for children look like they were created for children. So it can be kind of insulting to adults to use those kinds of materials. And there are phonics materials that have been developed specifically for adults. So, so again, using words that they are meaningful for them, like their names, the names of their family members, their address, starting with those kinds of words and not, again, these phonics materials that have these kind of rhyming words like, bat, cat, mat, like bat and mat are not really important words for them to know. So starting with the words that are most meaningful and relevant for them to learn. And then I also want to say that if you have like a 2 or 3 hour class, you might probably don't want to spend the entire time working on the alphabet or writing or phonics. That's going to be like really a brain drain for them. So you might spend part of the lesson on the phonics and learning how to write, but then move on to some other oral activities where they can participate orally and give their brain a rest when it comes to writing.
I love that suggestion. I'll just add the reminder, I would venture to guess that most, if not all of us, had been speaking English for several years before we ever learned to write. So our students can certainly learn to speak English before they learn to write it. And it gives them a way to feel successful in being able to produce English orally, even if they don't have the English to write about it yet. They can still survive, right? They can still ask questions. They can still talk to people and get things done as long as they can produce English or orally. They don't always have to have the writing there. The other thing I'm going to add about that, Nikki mentioned phonics materials, and I want to add a further caution about using phonics materials that are developed for native speakers, because they require that you know the vocabulary that's in them. So when you see B is for bear, you know the sound of B because you know that that's a picture of a bear. But if you don't know the word bear, you can't associate the B in bear with the letter B and the sound it makes. So if you think that's an oso, then you're not going to get the letter B and what the sound is. So be careful about making sure that students have the vocabulary that they need in those phonics materials, because otherwise you kind of go about it the wrong way. I say that from experience. I tried to learn Quiche, this Mayan language of Guatemala, and the materials they gave me were a book created for kids who already spoke Quiche. And my teacher was like, well, look, what sound do you think this makes? And I'm like, well, that's a raton. What, I don't know how to say that in Quiche, but I'm guessing, oh, that's whatever the sound is, right? And of course, I was totally wrong because I just had no idea what that vocabulary word was.